A white man demanded the baby be moved, but he got moved straight to the lawsuit section instead. A white man demanded the baby be moved, thinking his authority would go unquestioned. He didn't realize he was about to be moved straight into the lawsuit section instead. The moment he spoke, the cabin's balance of power flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The cry pierced the cabin, brief, soft, but unmistakable. Elias Rowan instinctively tightened his hold on the infant carrier strapped to his chest. Milo's eyelids fluttered before closing again, his little body shifting with a sigh as he resettled against his father's steady heartbeat. Elias exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but calculation. Every sound a baby made on board a flight could be misinterpreted, amplified, distorted through someone else's discomfort. He glanced down, readjusted the edge of the flannel blanket tucked near Milo's cheek, and leaned slightly back into his seat, attempting to be as still as possible. From the corner of his eye, he sensed movement, a flicker across the aisle. Victor Halden turned his head. It was subtle, like a bird snapping to attention at an unexpected rustle. Dressed in a navy blazer over a pressed gray shirt, Victor sat straight-backed with his legs neatly crossed, holding a tablet in one hand while his other thumb tapped impatiently on the armrest. Elias noted the precision of his grooming: slicked back hair, gleaming cufflinks, shoes polished so thoroughly the overhead lights glinted off them. But beneath the composed exterior was something volatile. A clipped breath, a tap too sharp, a sideways glance that lingered too long on the source of that brief infant cry. Elias didn't need confirmation. He'd seen this before, more times than he cared to count, in meetings where someone coughed too loud, in waiting rooms where a chair scrape turned heads. His profession demanded that he track patterns, people's habits, their impulses, their desire for control. Elias could already sense that Victor was not just irritated. He was building a case, in his head, if not aloud. A flight attendant rolled past with the drink cart, metal wheels humming faintly over the aisle's rubber mat. Victor didn't stop her. Instead, he turned to a young male crew member standing near the galley door, Rylan Kreft, according to the name stitched onto his Navy uniform. Elias watched as Victor tilted his head and made a beckoning gesture with two fingers, like summoning an employee during a business negotiation. Rylan approached, bending slightly to lower his voice. Victor leaned in, lips barely moving, speaking with the discreet authority of someone used to having their way without spectacle. Elias couldn't make out the words, but the body language was clear, measured annoyance cloaked in civility. Victor gestured toward Elias and Milo, and Rylan glanced over, nodding once, uncertainly. Elias shifted Milo gently and pretended not to notice, but his mind was already ticking through probabilities. He could practically hear the tone forming in Rylan's voice. "Would you mind?" Or, "For your convenience." Phrases dressed in politeness but engineered to enforce quiet compliance. He glanced down at Milo again. The baby's chest rose and fell steadily. No crying, no movement, just the soft rhythm of sleep. There was nothing disruptive, nothing out of order, nothing that would justify what was clearly coming. He closed his eyes briefly, not in weariness but in preparation. Rylan's shadow moved closer. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said politely, crouching slightly at the edge of Elias's row. "I hope everything's going smoothly. I just wanted to check in and see if you'd be willing to relocate to one of the rear seats, just for overall cabin comfort." Elias opened his eyes. "Is there a safety concern?" he asked quietly. The question caught Rylan off guard. His mouth opened, then closed again as he processed the unexpected reply. No safety issue. It's more about comfort levels for some passengers nearby." Elias kept his voice calm. "The baby is secure, not making noise, and I'm seated in the spot assigned on my boarding pass. Is there any specific policy that supports moving a quiet infant without cause?" There was a flicker behind Rylan's eyes. Not frustration, but hesitation, the brief stammer of someone realizing the script in his head no longer applied. "It's just a request, sir. To ensure everyone is comfortable," Elias finished for him. "I understand, but I'm comfortable here and my son is settled. I'd prefer not to disrupt him unnecessarily." From across the aisle, Victor turned a page on his tablet with theatrical slowness. Ryland straightened, caught between two forces he hadn't expected to clash. One seated quietly with a sleeping child, the other cloaked in entitled expectation. He offered a tight smile. "Understood, sir. I'll inform the lead." Elias nodded once. "Thank you." As Ryland retreated, Elias noticed Victor's jaw tighten, his gaze narrowing. The silent calculation behind his eyes shifted gears. He had expected compliance. Quick, quiet, obedient. Now, Elias had become an obstacle, not by raising his voice or making demands, but simply by refusing to yield without cause. Elias settled deeper into his seat and repositioned Milo's blanket. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane reached cruising altitude, casting cool reflections against the window. Around them, passengers returned to their novels, earbuds, or conversations. But the air felt different now. The social contract of polite silence had cracked, and something unspoken buzzed in the space between rows. He didn't know what would come next, only that something would. Victor shifted in his seat once more, his polished shoe tapping now with less rhythm, more edge. And behind his still posture, Elias saw it clearly. A man unwilling to let a perceived inconvenience go unanswered. The moment passed, but it didn't settle. Not yet. The calm before trouble often looks like safety. Victor Halden leaned into the aisle with a swift, practiced motion, his fingers snapping slightly to catch the attention of the passing flight attendant. His tone was low but sharpened with entitlement as he gestured subtly, then directly toward Elias Rowan and the infant secured to his chest. "I'd like to speak with someone about a seating issue," Victor said, his voice barely above a murmur, yet tinged with expectation. "That child is already becoming a disturbance. There must be an alternative." Ryland Kreft, the junior crew member barely out of probationary training, blinked with hesitation. He glanced between Victor's firm stare and the quiet father across the aisle. The baby, swaddled tightly against Elias's chest, wasn't crying, just resting with the occasional soft breath. Ryland shifted his weight, uncertain. Victor leaned in slightly as if to reinforce the gravity of the complaint. "I'm in 2A, a comfort tier seat. I shouldn't be expected to endure a screaming infant. It's only logical." From across the aisle, Elias watched, not hearing the words but immediately reading the choreography. Victor's poised shoulders, the firm chin, the slight downturn of the mouth, it all pointed to one thing: a calculated effort to reposition a problem. Elias had seen that body language before, in audit committees, compliance reviews, and negotiation tables. The person who believed inconvenience was injustice if they were the one being inconvenienced. Ryland nodded slightly and approached Elias, posture stiff, uniform just slightly wrinkled at the collar. "Sir," he began with polite reserve, "we were wondering if you might consider relocating, just temporarily, to a more private section toward the rear. It's for overall cabin comfort." Elias looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Is there a problem?" "No, not a problem," Ryland said quickly, his voice faltering. "Just a consideration. Some passengers are concerned about, well, the baby, noise levels, disruption." Elias didn't speak right away. He adjusted Milo's blanket with deliberate calm, ensuring the baby's face was exposed just enough for air and visibility. The infant remained peacefully asleep. His voice, when it came, was even. "Has there been a safety issue?" Ryland hesitated, caught. "No, sir, nothing like that." "Then I'll remain in the seat I paid for," Elias said, "unless there's a policy that says otherwise." The quiet in that moment was louder than the hum of the engines. Raylan nodded, retreating, but not before glancing back at Victor, who had already begun shaking his head in disapproval, as if the whole matter were being handled poorly. Victor's mouth tightened into a thin line, the refusal registering like a personal offense. A man who wasn't used to hearing the word no. Elias felt the air shift, like a cold current moving through warm space, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself but is impossible to ignore. He kept his gaze steady, his breathing controlled. The baby stirred once, but did not cry. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. The so-called disruption was resting quietly while the grown man across the aisle bristled with agitation. Victor adjusted his cufflinks with theatrical composure, then pulled out his phone and began typing. Elias didn't need to guess what was being written. He could already see the outline, a complaint framed in confident tones, asserting discomfort, mismanagement, perhaps even suggesting a safety risk where there was none. The script was familiar. Victors always knew how to make their grievances seem official. He looked away toward the window, letting his fingers rest lightly on Milo's carrier. The restraint he practiced was not just personal, it was strategic. In his line of work, documentation wasn't just a habit, it was a shield, and already part of him was beginning to take mental notes. Back across the aisle, Victor rose slightly in his seat, just enough to unbuckle and lean again into the aisle, his voice no longer concealed. "This is unacceptable," he said with a clipped breath. "Are you telling me I'm expected to sit through the entire flight with that noise next to me?" The heads of a few nearby passengers turned, slow and uncertain, catching only pieces of the conversation. Rylan returned quickly, hands open in a pacifying gesture. "Sir," Rylan said quietly, "I'm doing my best to assist, but there's no violation." "Then escalate it," Victor interrupted. "Speak to your supervisor, someone who understands how these seats are priced for comfort." Elias remained seated, unmoving. He didn't look at Victor, but the rising tension spilled into his peripheral awareness. Pressure built like cabin air before descent. The situation was shifting from discomfort to challenge. Inside, Elias weighed his choices carefully. Stand now, and he would reinforce the notion that his child was the problem. Comply quietly, and he would erase a line others like Victor would feel free to redraw again and again. But resist. That would require something more, a quiet confrontation of policy versus preference. He straightened slightly, shifted his shoulders, and prepared for what would follow. Across the aisle, Victor turned just enough to stare directly at him. No words, just a long, silent stare filled with disbelief that his request had not carried the expected weight. Elias met the gaze with quiet steadiness. No hostility, just something firmer, resolve. Behind his eyes, an entire history of knowing when to speak and when to document. This was not unfamiliar ground, only a different terrain. Victor exhaled sharply through his nose and sat back, muttering under his breath, "Typical." The hum of the cabin resumed its rhythm, but something beneath it had changed. The balance of the flight had shifted, the path altered not by turbulence but by unspoken challenge. Elias turned his attention back to Milo and gently touched his son's forehead. The baby remained still, unaware of the world's shifting currents around him. Elias didn't smile, but his expression softened, not in surrender, but in reminder. He was here for one reason, to protect. And now, that protection would no longer be quiet. Some demands grow louder when they are denied. Victor Halden stood abruptly, ignoring the lit seatbelt sign as the plane cruised smoothly toward its cruising altitude. The sharp motion caused several heads to turn. His expression was tense, his brow furrowed with exaggerated indignation as he jabbed a finger toward the other side of the aisle. "This is unacceptable," he announced in a tone just loud enough to draw attention, but measured enough to seem controlled. "Some of us paid for comfort." Across the aisle, Elias Rowan looked up, eyes steady but calm. Milo stirred softly against his chest but remained peaceful, his tiny breaths rhythmic against the fabric of the carrier. Elias said nothing yet. He simply observed. Victor's objective had shifted. It was no longer about a quiet flight. It was about dominance. If the baby wouldn't be moved through polite request, then pressure would do the job. He turned to the nearest flight attendant, his voice low and urgent. "That child is disrupting the entire cabin. He shouldn't be in this section," he said, gesturing with his entire arm as if to draw a border between us and them. Rylan Kreft, the junior flight attendant, stood awkwardly at Victor's side, eyes flicking between passengers and procedures replaying in his mind. He offered no direct answer, only a murmured, "I'll check with my supervisor," before retreating toward the front. Elias sat motionless, letting silence anchor him. He understood the pattern. He had seen it in corporate boardrooms, during regulatory reviews, and now, oddly, here in the narrow aisle of a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. Posturing, selective framing, control disguised as complaint. A few moments later, a taller man in a silver-trimmed navy vest appeared. Corin Hale, senior attendant. His stride was steady, his face practiced in neutral expressions. Without a glance toward Elias, Corin leaned slightly toward Victor, giving him the first word. "There have been disturbances from that direction," Victor said calmly, now moderating his voice. "I requested a resolution, but the gentleman is being uncooperative." Corin nodded slowly. No questions yet. No clarification. Just acceptance in posture. Elias tracked every move, the way Victor lowered his voice now to appear reasonable, the way Corin's stance mirrored deference instead of neutrality. Victor continued. "The baby cried several times, loudly, and I noticed passengers around me growing increasingly agitated." This was a fiction. Elias knew it. Most passengers hadn't even stirred. But he also knew how easily fiction could wear the clothes of truth when shaped early enough. Finally, Corin turned. "Sir," he said to Elias, "we understand that travel with infants can be stressful, and we want to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. Would you consider a temporary relocation to a quieter section at the rear of the aircraft?" His tone was light, coaxing, but the words were weighted. Elias's lips tightened. He kept his tone even. "Is there a safety issue with my current seat?" Corin hesitated. "It's more about guest experience. There have been concerns raised." Elias didn't blink. "Has my child been disruptive according to your policy standards?" Another pause. Rylan had returned and now stood to Corin's left, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "No formal disruption, sir," Corin admitted. "But we're trying to prevent further issues." "By preemptively relocating someone who hasn't caused one?" Elias asked, voice quiet but firm. A few passengers nearby watched now, silent but curious. One man peered over a paperback. A woman across the aisle adjusted her headphones slightly, not to block sound, but to hear better. Tension was no longer contained between two rows. It was blooming, slow and deliberate. Elias exhaled through his nose, subtly angling his wrist as he tapped a discreet corner of his watch. A soft vibration confirmed what only he knew. Recording activated. Years of compliance auditing had trained him to trust memory, but trust documentation more. "My child is secured, calm, and within all FAA regulations. If there's a documented safety or policy violation, I'd like to see it," he said clearly. Victor scoffed, arms crossing with performative disbelief. "This is outrageous," he muttered, loud enough for Corin to hear. Corin straightened slightly, recalibrating. "Sir," he said again to Elias, "we're just trying to de-escalate a situation that could make others uncomfortable." "And by that," Elias said, eyes steady, "you mean keeping one passenger comfortable by inconveniencing another?" Corin didn't respond. Victor leaned back into his seat, but not with ease. His mouth was tight, jaw clenched. He had expected immediate results, the same kind he likely commanded in meeting rooms or concierge desks. Instead, he watched a man not just resist, but document his resistance. Elias could feel the pressure building, not just from Victor, but from the unspoken rules of air travel. Be quiet, be passive, do not disrupt the flow. But this was different. The flow had already been disrupted, not by sound, but by entitlement. Corrin looked toward the cockpit and gave a small nod to Rylan. Something procedural was in motion. Elias watched carefully, knowing what that signal likely meant. He didn't move. He simply adjusted Milo's blanket with steady hands, then looked forward, voice low and clear. I am not moving unless safety requires it, and there is no such requirement. There was no raised voice, no confrontation, just facts delivered without apology. And across the aisle, Victor said nothing, but his eyes did not hide his intent. This wasn't over. When a story is repeated, it often changes shape. Corrin Hale stood just beyond Elias Rowan's aisle seat, one hand gripping the back of a nearby row, the other loosely cradling a tablet he hadn't looked at in minutes. His tone was polite but firm, the kind reserved for matters already decided. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stand and gather your belongings. We'll be moving you and your child to a different section to ensure overall guest experience. The phrase guest experience hung in the air like a fog, soft on the ears but utterly hollow. Elias stared up at the senior attendant, his expression unreadable but his mind suddenly sharpening, the words burning into his awareness like a red flag audit phrase with no underlying metric. He shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to disturb Milo, who still slept in his chest carrier, undisturbed by the soft tension building around them. I'd like to know what policy supports this request, Elias said, calmly but audibly enough that the rows around them could hear. Corrin blinked. His composure faltered for a fraction of a second before he defaulted to the rhythm of customer service. It's a matter of ensuring comfort and reducing disruption, sir. We're trying to avoid further conflict. There hasn't been a disruption, Elias replied. His voice remained low, composed, but it carried weight now. And my son has been asleep the entire time. If there's a policy that requires I move without cause, I'd like it cited, specifically. A few passengers across the aisle shifted slightly, the universal sign that people were listening without appearing to. Corrin exhaled, the barest sign of irritation escaping before he could reel it back in. The moment was changing. What had been a quiet nudge was becoming a recorded decision. Victor Halden, still seated across the aisle, let out a soft scoff and leaned toward the corridor. This is ridiculous, he muttered just loud enough for others to hear. I've flown in this class for years and never had to argue over common sense. He didn't look at Elias as he spoke. He didn't have to. The message was aimed for everyone else to absorb, that this situation, this problem, stemmed from someone refusing to be reasonable. Corrin straightened as if bolstered by Victor's passive support. Sir, he said again, this is not an accusation. We're simply trying to de-escalate a growing concern. Elias let his eyes move deliberately from Corrin to Victor, then back again. He knew this game. He'd seen it in boardrooms, policy meetings, and contract disputes. Vague words. No named source, no documentation. Just the quiet assumption that enough pressure would cause compliance. I'm not standing, Elias said evenly, and I'm not moving my son. There's no cause, no violation, no safety issue. Just one passenger's discomfort being treated as policy. There was a pause. Corrin hesitated. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit door stood shut and indifferent. He tapped the tablet's screen with a quick flick, then looked back at Elias. If we can't resolve this now, he said, voice lowering slightly, we may have to elevate this matter to the captain. That was the turn. Elias knew it. The moment when a vague request became a veiled threat, wrapped in procedure. The path ahead would fork, stand down, or draw the line. But he'd already made his choice the moment Corin uttered guest experience without reason. "I work in compliance," Elias said evenly. "That means I document everything, especially when procedures are enforced without written support. So, if this moves forward, I will need every part of it justified and accounted for, including your directive, your phrasing, and the absence of any cited regulation." It was subtle, but Corin's face tightened. The tablet in his hand dipped slightly. Across the aisle, Victor gave a slight shake of his head and muttered again, this time more irritated. "This is why people like this ruin travel for everyone else." That broke through the surface. A few passengers, one row ahead, one row behind, looked up directly this time. Eyes narrowed not at Elias, but at Victor. His words had landed poorly, not because they were loud, but because they assumed others would agree. Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply rested his hand on Milo's blanket and made sure the baby remained still, breathing softly against his chest. This was no longer about noise or comfort. It was about setting a precedent, one that would define who got moved and why on flights like this. Corin took a step back and turned slightly, pressing a button near his earpiece. "This is Hale. I need a word with the captain regarding a non-compliant guest in row 14. His tone was clipped now. The mask of professionalism was beginning to fray. The intercom crackled faintly at the front of the aircraft. A signal tone blinked above the aisle. The cabin had changed. Elias exhaled slowly. His thumb subtly brushed across the edge of his watch, activating the discreet recording function he'd trained himself to use without drawing attention. It was habit now. Defensive, measured, but essential. Victor leaned back, his confidence settling back in, oblivious to what Elias had just done. He couldn't see the shift because he still believed his words would vanish. His version would be the one remembered. That authority would always be presumed. As Corin walked away, retreating toward the front, Elias stayed seated, eyes forward, arms wrapped securely around Milo's carrier. The child stirred slightly but did not wake. The plane flew on, altitude unchanged, but everything else had shifted. The aisle no longer felt like a hallway. It felt like a courtroom waiting for someone to take the stand. And in this case, the record had already begun. A request without reason becomes a command without authority. Security protocol has been invoked. The announcement was not broadcast to the cabin. It came quietly, spoken in a clipped murmur from Corin's intercom headset to the cockpit, but the effect rippled outward like an unseen shockwave. Elias didn't flinch. He sat still, Milo's tiny head rising and falling with each breath against his chest, a living rhythm that kept him centered. His hand adjusted the baby's blanket slightly, not out of distraction but control. Every movement was deliberate now. Across the aisle, Victor's posture shifted. He leaned back in his seat, legs crossed, fingers laced smugly over his stomach. His expression carried a thin smile, not one of amusement, but of expectation. He had pushed the situation into official territory. His objective had transformed yet again, no longer just to inconvenience, but to remove. In his mind, the flight was too confined for negotiation. Someone had to yield, and it would not be him. Corin approached, this time with less neutrality and more stiffness in his shoulders. His voice was quiet, professional, but tinged with something rehearsed. "Sir," he said, leaning down toward Elias, "please understand that for the continued comfort of our guests and in accordance with our onboard protocol, we are required to ensure full cooperation from all passengers. Non-compliance may result in a formal incident report upon landing." Elias raised his eyes slowly, his tone calm but unwavering. "I am fully cooperative," he said, "with safety, not with discrimination." The words landed with precision. Corin hesitated, not long but enough to register. Behind them, two passengers shifted in their seats, eyes flicking forward. Elias could feel the atmosphere change. The cabin was no longer passively watching. It was listening. "I must advise," Corin continued, "that any further refusal to follow crew instructions could result in you being escorted from the aircraft upon arrival." "Then I will need the exact crew instruction," Elias replied evenly, "and the policy reference it's based on. I'll comply with what's real, not what's convenient." Corin's jaw moved slightly as if grinding his next words before swallowing them. He gave no response. Instead, he turned and walked briskly toward the galley. Victor exhaled with a satisfied nod, then muttered just loudly enough for the row behind him to hear, "I've handled situations like this before. They always fold eventually." The man smirked, confident his demand would be obeyed, unaware that every witness, every camera, and every legal clause had already been anticipated by the family ready to enforce accountability. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable authority, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. He didn't know those words were being recorded, not just remembered, captured. Elias had tapped his watch minutes earlier. The device, almost indistinguishable from a standard model, was quietly archiving the entire interaction, including Victor's latest slip into arrogance. It was a precaution born from years in compliance audits, where the truth often relied less on memory and more on metadata. The baby stirred, shifting in his carrier. A brief squeak escaped Milo's lips, followed by a soft sigh as he settled again. No cry, no distress, no disruption, just the gentle sound of an infant readjusting in sleep. And in that moment, Victor's entire argument cracked. Passengers began whispering, subtle at first. A man in row 7 leaned into his companion. A younger man 3 seats behind raised an eyebrow. Another passenger, mid-30s, lifted his phone discreetly. Not to record, but to prepare. People sensed the scale of the moment changing. Victor's smile faded. Corin re-emerged, this time without a tray or clipboard. His hands were empty, a telling absence. He stood beside Elias's seat again, but did not repeat the earlier warning. Instead, he kept his voice low. "Sir, the captain has been notified. You will not be forcibly removed mid-air, but we are required to file an incident report. Your name will be included." Elias nodded once. "So will yours," he said plainly, along with the time the security protocol was triggered and the absence of any supporting policy. Corin blinked. "You're welcome to speak with the terminal staff when we land." "I intend to," Elias replied, "with documentation." Victor shifted again. "So, now we're letting people disrupt flights with babies and attitude? This is how low we've dropped?" He scoffed, addressing no one directly but loud enough for all to hear. Elias didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the aisle ahead, watching the silent theater unfold. His voice remained steady as he spoke softly, mostly to himself. "This isn't about noise. It never was." The plane began its initial descent. The seatbelt light flicked on with a chime that sounded sharper than before, not because it was louder, but because the tension had tuned every ear. Elias secured Milo's carrier strap, checked the overhead, and exhaled slowly. His thoughts were not on landing. They were on aftermath, on systems, on patterns he had seen in boardrooms, where appearances shaped decisions unless someone forced the truth into daylight. The cabin lights dimmed for approach, but in Elias's mind, clarity was only growing. He leaned back slightly, brushing Milo's head gently with his fingers. The child did not stir. A kind of peace had returned, but it was layered now, not born of calm skies, but of conviction. A few rows ahead, someone murmured, "This doesn't feel right." Someone else nodded, and Victor heard it. The aircraft flew on toward Northreach, not just carrying passengers but the heavy truth of what had just taken place, wrapped not in shouting, but in silence, timing, and the quiet build of momentum that would not stop at the gate. Some journeys end at the gate, others begin there. The aircraft touched down at Northreach Terminal with a soft jolt, the wheels skimming the tarmac as the cabin lights shifted from dim to bright. But something was off. Passengers remained seated longer than usual, glancing around as if waiting for a cue. The usual rustle of belts and bags never came. The air felt suspended, not with turbulence, but tension. Elias Rowan remained in his seat, Milo asleep against his chest, secured and undisturbed. His hands rested calmly over the baby's carrier, but his mind was alert, calculating. The conflict had grown beyond the cabin. Now it would enter the realm of reports, statements, and interpretations. He knew from experience what happened next wouldn't be determined by truth alone, but by how truth was recorded. Across the aisle, Victor Halden adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, his chin tilted upward. He leaned toward Corin Hale, the senior flight attendant, voice low but forceful. "I expect formal action noted in the report. I've dealt with this sort of thing before." Corin gave a small nod, but there was a faint twitch at his temple, a crack in his neutral veneer. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes forward, toward the front of the cabin where two uniformed men had just boarded. Their entrance was quiet, deliberate. No announcement, no flash of badges, only presence. One had a clipboard, the other a small tablet. Both wore navy with discreet security emblems stitched into the shoulder, clearly airport terminal officers. Neither looked particularly pleased to be there. The officers halted near row 3, just behind the cockpit door. The taller one scanned the cabin briefly before speaking, his voice professional but clipped. "We'd like to speak with the individuals involved in the seat relocation request. Can someone brief us?" Corin stepped forward quickly, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "Yes, officer. The issue involved a disruptive passenger who declined a relocation request made for the comfort of others. There were escalating concerns." "Disruptive?" Elias's voice cut in, not loud, but clear. His gaze didn't waver. The officer with the clipboard, Officer Darren Vask, as his nameplate read, turned to Elias, scanning him briefly, then lowered his eyes to the small child asleep in the carrier. "Sir, are you the one referred to here?" Darren asked. "I am," Elias answered, measured. "And I'd like to provide a full account, but I ask that it be done in proper order, including policy references if we're going to use terms like disruptive." Corin hesitated. He opened his mouth but closed it again. The second officer, younger, stepped in. "Let's proceed one at a time." Victor rose then, unprompted. "Excuse me, officers. I'm the one who filed the concern. The noise and environment were not conducive to rest. I have a right to a professional flight experience. I pay—" "We'll speak with you in a moment, sir," Officer Vask said, his tone firm. Victor blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He stepped back, lips tight. Officer Vask turned back to Corin. "When exactly did you request this passenger to relocate?" "Approximately 20 minutes after takeoff," Corin replied. "And the reason?" Corin drew a slow breath. "For overall cabin comfort. A few guests raised concerns about the child's presence." "Was the child crying continuously?" Corin hesitated. "Not continuously, but intermittently." Elias tilted his head slightly. "He cried once, for less than 10 seconds. He then fell asleep. He's been secured the entire flight." Vask turned to him. "Do you have any record of the exchange?" Elias gave a single nod and tapped his wristwatch. "I do. Audio begins before the initial request. I'd prefer to submit it formally." The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "You've been recording this?" "I work in compliance. It's a habit," Elias said simply. "The context matters." The atmosphere shifted. Victor, still standing near his seat, folded his arms. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. You're taking his word over the cruise? No, Vask said. We're taking all accounts under review, including yours. Please step aside with my colleague. Victor's jaw tensed as the younger officer led him forward. Behind them, murmurs stirred among passengers. No one had moved to leave. Everyone was watching now, not a spectacle, but a reckoning. Vask returned his attention to Corin. Do you have the written policy used to justify the relocation? Corin's eyes flicked toward the galley wall, then to his tablet. It's under guest management protocol. Section 3. May I see it? Vask asked. Corin's fingers hovered uncertainly above the tablet, scrolling. A long pause stretched. I'm not finding the exact reference. Elias spoke, voice steady but pointed. That's because there is no written clause allowing relocation based solely on a single passenger's subjective comfort, especially without evidence of disruption. There was no safety concern cited, no noise violation, only one complaint. Vask glanced between them, weighing silence against tension. We'll need formal statements from all parties, he said at last. On ground level, in writing. You'll be escorted shortly. Victor, now watching from the aisle, laughed dryly. This is overkill. No, sir, Vask said without looking at him. This is procedure. Elias looked down at Milo, who shifted faintly but remained asleep. The baby's calm contrasted the storm swirling just inches away. Through the window, the gate bridge was being extended slowly toward the aircraft, but the moment was frozen in the cabin. Corin stepped back, lips pressed tight. Elias caught it, a twitch of discomfort in the man's jaw when policy had been mentioned. Not fear, not guilt, just pressure, the kind that cracks when facts don't bend. Around them, the cabin buzzed in low voices and sidelong glances. The incident was no longer a disagreement. It had become something heavier, something with documentation, timelines, and consequences. And as the officers began organizing deplaning procedures, one fact loomed in every mind. This would not be resolved by stepping off the plane. Not today. Authority wavers when facts refuse to bend. The interview room was small, fluorescent lit, and silent enough to catch the faint buzz of a thermostat struggling to maintain temperature. Elias sat upright in a molded plastic chair, Milo still strapped snugly against his chest in the carrier, his tiny head nestled beneath the curve of his father's chin. Across the narrow space, separated by a thin partition that gave only the illusion of privacy, Victor Halden fidgeted audibly. His expensive watch clinked against the table's edge every time he tapped his wrist, an unintentional metronome to his mounting frustration. Elias didn't speak first. He waited, eyes trained not on Victor but on the two terminal officers standing just inside the doorway, both dressed in standard dark jackets, clipboards tucked beneath their arms. Their names were Raff and Denlin, though they hadn't introduced themselves formally. Their posture was watchful but not aggressive, yet even in their neutrality, Elias could tell they were waiting for clarity. "Let's begin with your version of events," Officer Raff said, gesturing slightly toward Elias. "In order of occurrence, if you don't mind." Elias nodded once, the motion calm and practiced. He began without preamble. At approximately 28 minutes into the flight, a passenger across the aisle, Mr. Halden, flagged a junior crew member, gestured toward me and my son, and initiated a complaint regarding noise, despite no disruptive behavior. The child was calm. I observed the conversation's tone and posture, which reflected pressure rather than concern. His voice was level, paced for clarity. He did not speak to convince. He spoke to record. I was then approached and asked, politely, but without policy backing, if I would consider relocating for overall cabin comfort. I asked if there was a safety reason. I was told no. I declined respectfully. The situation escalated from there. He paused, then added, "I have a time-stamped voice-activated recording of all interactions from that point forward, if that would be helpful. Officer Denlin blinked once, interest sharpening. You have a recording? Elias met his eyes. Yes, I'm in compliance for a living. I routinely document procedural interactions when policy is involved. It's a safeguard for everyone. There was a short silence. Officer Raff made a note on his clipboard without looking up. Denlin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Behind the partition, Victor's chair screeched slightly as he leaned forward, breaking the quiet with an edge to his voice. This is ridiculous. I only asked for a basic accommodation. The baby was making noise. Other passengers were uncomfortable. Officer Raff turned slightly. We'll get to your statement in a moment, Mr. Halden. Victor exhaled heavily but said nothing more. Elias resumed. The senior crew member, Corin Hale, became involved. I was asked to move again, formally this time, but still without a cited policy. I requested written guidelines to justify the relocation. None were produced. I remained seated and stated I would not move my infant without cause. Security protocol was then invoked mid-flight, and I was framed as uncooperative. Denlin tilted his head. Did you threaten anyone? No. My tone remained steady. I asked for policy citations and explained I was recording for accuracy. That's all. Another note scribbled. Victor stood abruptly, hands clenched at his sides. You're going to take his word just because he came prepared. This is manipulation. He's using the system to make me look bad. Please remain seated, Officer Denlin said, more firmly this time. Victor sat back down but didn't stop talking. He was creating a scene by refusing to follow instructions. I felt unsafe. That's why I asked to be moved. Not because of the baby, but because of his attitude. Which part of his attitude made you feel unsafe? Officer Raff asked, pen hovering. Victor opened his mouth, then hesitated. He was defensive. He questioned the crew. Elias stayed still, knowing silence sometimes said more than defense. He watched as Denlin turned a page and scanned something quickly. Then came the pivot. We've reviewed Corin Hale's incident report. It doesn't mention any physical disruption, only a verbal refusal to comply with a relocation request. And the recording, Raff added, if it matches your version, Mr. Rowan, may clarify tone and language used by all parties. Victor's voice sharpened. So now I'm on trial for asking a question. No one's on trial, Denlin replied coolly, but we are documenting statements, and we do have procedures for handling false or misleading claims. Victor froze. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, just long enough to notice. Raff leaned slightly toward Elias. Would you be willing to submit that recording to our internal review team for chain of custody processing? I already have it ready, Elias said. He reached slowly into the front pocket of his laptop bag and pulled out a compact device. There's a transcript log, too, if needed. Denlin accepted the device carefully and handed it to a waiting assistant just outside the door. Victor's gaze followed it like a man watching a door close behind him. Corin Hale entered moments later, called in by request. He looked less confident than he had mid-flight. The questions came fast. What exact policy did you refer to when making the relocation request? Was it documented before the flight? Did you verify the child's restraint compliance? Did you witness any disruption yourself? Corin faltered. He checked his tablet, thumb sliding over the screen. I used standard language for guest experience. But was there a policy? Raff pressed. Corin looked up slowly, then shook his head once. No written policy was cited. It was discretionary judgment. Denlin closed his notebook with a quiet snap. Then we'll need written statements from each of you, he said. Today. If you fail to submit, the report proceeds without your input. Victor shifted again, the confident air from earlier now replaced with a faint sheen of unease across his brow. What happens if someone gets it wrong?" he asked. Denlan met his gaze squarely. False or incomplete statements, especially in cases involving infants, are treated seriously. You're entitled to your opinion, Mr. Halden, not to your own facts. Elias didn't smile. He simply nodded once and turned his attention back to Milo, who had remained quiet through the entire interview, as if instinctively aware that silence held more power than outcry. The room's energy shifted. No longer a place for quick judgments or whispered alliances, it had become something else entirely, a formal arena where details reigned and assumptions died slowly. Elias began to write, the pen moving with clarity born of preparation. Across the table, Victor hesitated, still processing that his influence hadn't followed him into this room. Outside the thin door, footsteps echoed faintly. More voices, more movement, but inside the space, the quiet deepened, stretched by implication and tightened by consequence. The moment was no longer a scuffle between passengers. It was now something institutional, procedural, and permanent. The air hung still, and then, processes begin where pressure fails. The message came just before dusk. Elias sat at his small desk near the apartment window, the room dim except for the soft amber light of a floor lamp. Milo, asleep in a carrier slung gently across his chest, breathed in rhythm with the faint ticking of a wall clock. The chime of a new email broke the silence. Subject line: Larkspur Internal Review Request. Immediate attention required. Elias didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, already knowing this moment would arrive. He opened the message. The tone was formal, clinical. An Internal Review Division officer named Marshal Corrin requested a detailed account of the incident aboard Flight 611. The key words were underlined: full documentation, timeline, and any supporting recordings. This was no longer a complaint. It was now a case. Elias's fingers moved without hesitation. He opened his notes, sorted audio files, reviewed timestamps. Every detail was arranged with precision. He labeled folders by event, aligned transcripts with video stills from his watch camera, and annotated each one with policy reference numbers. The routine was familiar. This was not just a response. It was a record fortified by calm during chaos. Across the city, in a marble-floored office with glass walls and a view of the bay, Victor Halden poured a drink and laughed with disbelief. His voice echoed as he paced in front of his legal advisor, Raymond Klenn. "This is ridiculous," Victor snapped, rolling his sleeves up. "I raised a simple concern about cabin noise, and now I'm in a discrimination inquiry?" Klenn didn't look amused. He scrolled through the summary report on his tablet, brow furrowed. "You're not just mentioned," he said. "You're listed as the initiating party. They've logged it under targeted displacement attempt. Family passenger." Victor's smile faded. He sat down, knuckles tightening around the glass. "They can't be serious." "They are," Klenn replied, tapping on a paragraph. "The report states the flight crew's actions were initiated following an external request from a fellow passenger without documented justification." "That's you." Victor's jaw twitched. "He's manipulating the system." Klenn leaned forward. "He submitted a recording, Victor. You didn't think he'd come unprepared, did you?" Back in his apartment, Elias sent the file upload confirmation with a soft click. His submission included timestamps: 14:22, baby cries once; 14:23, Victor gestures to crew; 14:26, initial relocation request; 14:32, formal refusal begins. He annotated Corrin Hale's use of guest experience consideration, underlining how that vague phrase lacked procedural backing. He attached a summary note: no recorded breach of noise regulation, security policy, or federal travel code. Discretion applied without objective trigger. Request made to move infant, not adult. The conflict, once confined to rows 17 and 18 on Larkspur Flight 611, now entered a structured arena. Here, emotion counted less than pattern. Elias leaned back, hand resting over Milo's tiny sleeping form, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. The hardest part wasn't submitting the evidence. It was knowing that systems didn't always respond to facts, but to pressure. Yet something felt different this time. Something was shifting. 2 days later, an analyst named Darren Vale from the airline's Internal Legal Review Office contacted Elias directly by phone. "Mr. Rowan," the voice began, professional but less distant than expected. "I wanted to inform you that your recording aligns with a pattern we've seen in 2 other recent complaints. Both involved a similar phrasing from flight staff and a common thread: passengers with infants being relocated under passenger-initiated pressure." Elias didn't speak for a moment. Darren continued, "We'd like your permission to widen the scope of this review. Your file is the most detailed one we've received." "You have it," Elias said quietly. "No redactions, no anonymity. If this helps someone else, I want it used." The silence on the other end wasn't hesitation. It was appreciation. "We'll keep you updated," Darren added. "Expect formal documentation of the review's expansion within 48 hours. Across town, Victor paced with agitation. His legal team had advised caution. He ignored it. He sent a statement to the airline. Passenger Elias Rowan appeared evasive, confrontational, and disrupted cabin harmony. Flight crew responded reasonably. My concerns were not personal, but necessary for cabin order. It was meant to sound polished. But the language was reactive, defensive, and subtly contradicted earlier informal statements already recorded. Glenn warned him about this. "The system doesn't care about tone," Glenn had said. "It cares about timelines, and his are cleaner than yours." Victor dismissed the warning, replying curtly, "He's a nobody with a baby and a chip on his shoulder. I've chaired panels. I've flown executive class longer than you've been in litigation." But beneath the bravado, Victor felt the first tremor of uncertainty. He checked his email inbox 3 times that hour. No response. Meanwhile, Elias received his next message. "Per your consent, your submission is now part of a Tier 2 inquiry. Relevant language and conduct logs from flight crew have been flagged. Thank you for your cooperation." Attached were anonymized excerpts from prior incidents. They were disturbingly similar: passengers with infants, vague guest comfort justifications, and pressure from more affluent vocal travelers. One internal message stood out: "Just keep the noise issue quiet, move the parent if needed. Don't provoke the louder guy, he pays for business class." Elias read it twice. Victor hadn't just acted entitled, he had exploited a culture built around appeasement. And that culture had started to leave paper trails. Elias didn't celebrate. He opened his notebook and made one final entry under the file. Escalation threshold reached. System response active. Next phase, institutional acknowledgement. He closed the lid of his laptop and looked down at Milo, now stirring slightly, arms stretching in his sleep. When patterns emerge, excuses disappear. The formal notice arrived without warning. An envelope slid under Victor Halden's office door bearing the crest of the Northreach Arbitration Council. He tore it open with the casual confidence of a man expecting affirmation. Instead, the words struck like ice water. "You are hereby notified that you have been named as a respondent in an ongoing investigation regarding the creation of a hostile environment aboard Larkspur Flight 611. Victor froze. He stood in his corner office overlooking the steel skyline of Barrington Financial, hands tightening around the letter. It was supposed to be a routine post-flight complaint. A baby crying. An inconsiderate father. He had made a request. Firm, perhaps, but reasonable, at least in his eyes. Now he was being formally accused. No longer the complainant, but the accused. The suit that once fit like armor now felt suffocating. Down the coast, Elias Rowan sat at his kitchen table in a modest Northreach apartment, Milo sleeping peacefully nearby, one hand curled around a toy bear. Elias read the same notice on his tablet, this one addressed to him as a witness and contributor. Unlike Victor, he wasn't surprised. He had been waiting, methodically documenting, filing, and responding when necessary. This wasn't vindication. It was a checkpoint. The hearing was scheduled via secure video. When the time came, Elias wore a gray shirt, neutral and unobtrusive. He positioned the camera precisely, placed Milo in a side crib where he'd be visible but undisturbed, and logged in. Victor joined minutes later, posture still upright but voice clipped when greeted by the arbitration facilitator. A neutral background framed him. Books, art, the projection of calm power, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "Mr. Halden," the facilitator began, "you have been named in a procedural review regarding conduct aboard Larkspur Flight 611. Mr. Rowan is present as witness and affected party. We will review the statements and materials provided." Victor leaned in. "I made a complaint in good faith. I was disrupted by a crying child. I asked to be accommodated." Elias said nothing. He let the silence stretch. The facilitator tapped on his screen. "Your original statement noted repeated disruptions, physical discomfort, and lack of crew action. However, Mr. Rowan's submitted documentation, including time-stamped audio, indicates the child remained calm for the duration of the flight. Would you like to amend your claim before we continue?" Victor blinked. "That must be a misunderstanding. I was reacting in the moment." "You also insisted Mr. Rowan be relocated, and, when denied, requested his removal via in-flight security protocol," the facilitator continued. "Your reasoning, as recorded, included phrases such as, 'People like that shouldn't sit up front.'" Victor exhaled slowly, glancing off screen. "I was referring to children." Elias's voice came in quietly but clearly. "You never used the word child, not once. You referenced disruptive types and unprepared passengers. All euphemisms, none factual." The facilitator nodded. "We're here to clarify truth, not interpretation. Mr. Rowan, can you briefly confirm your child's behavior during the flight?" Elias did not flinch. "My son slept for 70% of the flight. He stirred once and was comforted within seconds. He was secured the entire time. I was approached twice, once to move without justification and once with threat of report. Both actions were unsupported by written policy." Victor interjected. "This is being taken too far. I expressed concern. What else is a passenger supposed to do when something feels wrong?" The facilitator's voice hardened slightly. "Concern is not on trial. Weaponizing procedure to target another passenger without cause is." Victor fell silent. The session continued with clinical precision. The panel reviewed the sequence of events, the internal airline notes, none of which matched Victor's claims entirely. Corin Hale's own report was discussed. When asked to supply the policy used to justify Elias's relocation request, Corin had submitted a vague directive regarding guest comfort with no direct citation. That, too, was noted. At one point, Victor's legal advisor entered the virtual room and requested a recess. It was denied. This wasn't a trial, it was an inquiry, but the wait felt just as real. Later, Elias was asked if he had anything more to add. He shook his head. "The facts speak for themselves. I'm not looking for punishment. I'm looking for prevention. This shouldn't happen again, not to me, not to anyone." When the call ended, Victor remained in his seat long after the screen dimmed. The silence of his office returned, heavy and unfamiliar. He hadn't just lost control of a situation, he had lost the privilege of assuming he'd always be believed. In a different corner of the city, Milo snored gently as Elias closed his laptop, exhaling through his nose. It wasn't over, not yet, but the system had listened. For once, it had moved. Some seats change without anyone standing up. The notification arrived quietly, almost unceremoniously. Nestled between routine emails about quarterly compliance updates and a subscription renewal Elias had nearly forgotten. The subject line read, "Case Review Findings. Finalized." There were no exclamation marks, no blinking alerts, just a flat statement, sterile in tone, yet pulsing with weight. Elias opened it without ceremony. Milo asleep in his crib beside his desk, the soft, rhythmic hum of the baby monitor playing counterpoint to the rapid beating of Elias's heart. His fingers hesitated above the trackpad for a beat, just long enough for doubt to whisper, but then clicked. The document opened to a page marked Conclusion. And there it was. Simple, stark, irrefutable. The initiating party's request constituted a violation of Equitable Passenger Treatment Protocol. The subsequent crew actions did not align with documented policy, and the forced relocation effort lacked safety justification. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair. His breathing, at first steady, caught slightly in his chest. He read it again, then again. Each line confirmed what he had known, but had not dared to expect would be admitted so clearly. Victor Halden's name appeared 5 times in the findings, and each instance shifted in tone, from concerned passenger to initiating party to contributor to an escalated hostile environment. By the end, he was no longer described with any courtesy. He was a caution. The panel's language was meticulous. They dissected the moment when Rylan first approached with the vague request. They analyzed Corin Hale's phrasing, guessed experience considerations, and flagged it as insufficiently grounded in operational directive. Every timestamp Elias had offered, every quotation from his recording, had been cross-validated and woven into the timeline. He hadn't expected victory. He had expected ambiguity, a polite dismissal, maybe a closed-door apology. But this was structural, not personal. And yet, instead of triumph, Elias felt an odd sense of distance, as if reading a well-written article about someone else's fight. The emotional intensity that had burned in him for months had cooled, reduced now to embers he wasn't sure he wanted to rekindle. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't relieved either. Just quiet. He closed the laptop and stood, walking slowly to the window. Outside, the world moved as it always did. Cars humming past, leaves twitching on their branches, a cyclist weaving between traffic cones on the far side of the street. Nothing had changed out there, but something had changed in here. His reflection in the glass looked calm, maybe too calm. The door creaked behind him. Milo stirred in the crib but didn't wake. Elias turned back and looked at the child, still small but stronger now, breathing deep, his tiny fists resting against his chest in trust. The report hadn't just confirmed that Victor was wrong. It had confirmed that Elias was right to stay seated, to ask questions, to press for the policy that didn't exist. He walked back to his desk and reopened the file, scrolling further. Corin Hale was to be reassigned, not terminated, not publicly reprimanded, but retrained. His name appeared beside terms like misapplication of policy language and corrective procedural review. Elias stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't vengeance, but it was movement. He remembered Corin's face during the confrontation, neutral yet complicit. The way he had spoken over Elias while nodding along with Victor's claims. The way he had said, "Let's just make this easier for everyone." A phrase Elias had now learned was flagged by the review panel as a non-operationally supported de-escalation tactic. There had been nothing easy about it. Elias's phone buzzed, a message from one of the review officers. "Thank you again for your patience and documentation. Your clarity helped us examine the chain of decision-making in full." He didn't reply right away. He reread the final paragraph of the report instead. A quiet line stood out. Documentation provided by Mr. Rowan reflects the value of passenger vigilance in supporting equitable policy enforcement. A strange, involuntary smile flickered across his face. Not because he was proud, but because he knew now that the smallest details mattered. The slight tilt of a voice, the way a phrase could mask an agenda, the power of a recorded sentence spoken without awareness. He looked at Milo again. The boy would never remember the flight, but the flight would remember him. "It won't be," Merrick said. "We've seen what happens when people assume things are working because no one complains loud enough." Outside the glass, Milo crawled clumsily across the playmat, reaching for a small plastic airplane. The sight nearly broke Elias's focus. That tiny hand, grasping for a toy replica of the real machine that had nearly become a symbol of exclusion, was a simple but sobering image. The baby, whose presence had once been seen as an inconvenience, was now the reason the policy book was being rewritten. Victor Halden had quietly withdrawn from his board positions months earlier, citing personal reasons. Within professional circles, his name had become a cautionary tale, how unchecked entitlement could trigger structural fallout. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. He hadn't sought revenge. He had only refused to yield to a system that mistook preference for principle. Callan stood and extended his hand. "You've helped us more than you know." Elias shook it firmly. "Just make sure it lasts longer than this meeting." As he stepped out into the hallway, picking Milo up gently into his arms, Elias didn't feel triumphant. He felt anchored. Not every resolution came with applause or headlines. Some came with footnotes in policy manuals and safer flights for the next parent who refused to shrink. He looked once more through the conference room glass before walking away. Milo rested against his shoulder, the soft rhythm of breath against his neck. Change is strongest when built into structure. The wheels of the aircraft touched down with a soft thud, the cabin lurching forward in sync as the brakes engaged. Elias Rowan kept his gaze on the seat back ahead, one hand gently steadying the carrier strapped against his chest where his son Milo slept, head tilted to the side in peaceful oblivion. The flight had been uneventful, at least on the surface. Yet beneath the practiced smiles and smooth announcements, something had changed. Elias felt it not in any one moment, but in dozens of small ones. A brief pause before requests, the tone in a steward's voice, the clarity in the way instructions were explained. He noticed everything. The difference began at the gate. The attendant, a tall, clean-shaven man in his early 30s named Brent, had greeted Elias with a direct, respectful nod and offered assistance not as a favor, but as a standard. "Just let us know if you need help with boarding, Mr. Rowan," Brent had said, hands neatly folded over the kiosk, eyes meeting his without the usual flicker of surprise that came when seeing a man traveling alone with an infant. Now, on this return flight from a work conference, Elias had agreed to take a seat near the front of the aircraft for easier deplaning. It was the same seat number he had once refused to leave, and though the cabin looked nearly identical, the atmosphere felt different. Not warmer, exactly, just more precise, more accountable. The lead flight attendant, a young man named Kyle, approached him halfway through the flight after Milo let out a brief cry. Not a wail, not even a true complaint, just the soft, tired noise babies make when waking. Kyle crouched beside his row instead of towering over him. "All good here, sir?" he asked with a calm smile. "Just let me know if you need anything." Elias had nodded, mildly surprised. "We're fine, thank you." He watched Kyle walk away, each step deliberate. Not rehearsed, but thoughtful. These weren't just random gestures. Elias had once fought to prove a point that now seemed quietly acknowledged in these simple human interactions. But the acknowledgement brought with it something else. Memory. Not the kind that roared with anger or replayed in fast motion, but the kind that hovered just behind the eyes, a flicker of past tension that waited for the next trigger. He found himself unconsciously noting every staff movement, every exchanged glance. Old habits, shaped by necessity, didn't fade easily. He noticed how requests to other passengers were prefaced with "due to regulation," or for your safety. Phrases once absent but now applied evenly across the rows. The rules hadn't changed. The enforcement had. At the baggage claim, a man in a blue jacket accidentally bumped Elias's shoulder. "Sorry, I didn't see you," the man muttered, stepping aside. Elias offered a nod, but his mind went briefly elsewhere. The last time someone had not seen him, it had led to demands, confrontation, and tribunals. Now it only led to silence. A moment passed. He exhaled. The next day, an email arrived. The subject line was simple: "We'd love to feature your story." It was from a journalist with a travel safety blog inviting him to speak about his experience, the case, the reforms that followed. Elias read it twice. Then he archived it. Later that week, a colleague from the compliance department approached him after a briefing. "I heard about what happened," the man said, his tone carefully neutral. "Must have been a lot." Elias nodded, unsure how much to share. "It taught me a few things," he replied evenly. "You ever think about writing it up somewhere?" "I think the story's already written," Elias said, adjusting the carrier strap as Milo squirmed in his sleep. "And the right people have read it." The colleague didn't push further. That was the thing about quiet victories. People either respected them or tried to inflate them. Elias had no interest in either. He walked past the glass wall of the terminal, sunlight catching the reflection of planes taxiing in the distance. For a moment, he saw the mirrored image of himself carrying Milo, smaller than the jet engines behind him, yet somehow weightier. The memory of that earlier flight was no longer raw, but it hadn't dulled either. It lived in how he stepped forward into the aircraft, in how he listened when Milo cried, in how he responded when someone asked if he needed to be moved, just for comfort. It lived in the pause before reacting, the decision to document rather than shout, the choice to trust systems to correct themselves, slowly, painfully, but completely. On a new flight weeks later, Elias sat in the aisle again. Milo, now older and fidgety, reached for the laminated safety card with eager fingers. Across from them, a man adjusted his tie and glanced over, but this time his gaze did not linger. It moved on. There was no Victor Halden on this flight, no Rylan Kreft, just passengers and policies that had learned, however quietly, from the consequences of neglect. The seatbelt light pinged. Elias leaned back, his grip on the carrier relaxed, his breathing even. The turbulence he'd once feared was now internal, a ghost of vigilance that softened in the face of small, consistent changes. He declined an interview request later that month. He declined a podcast feature. When asked again, he simply said, "It's not my story anymore. It belongs to the people who made the change." He adjusted Milo's seatbelt one more time, securing it with a soft click. The hum of the engine was steady. The skies were clear. Not every victory needs a witness. The image returned without warning. Elias Rowan had not thought about the flight for months, not in detail, not in structure, but today, as he stood in the hallway outside his son's bedroom, watching the quiet rise and fall of Milo's chest in sleep, the full memory returned with vivid sharpness, as if summoned by the stillness itself. The moment was small, quiet, unremarkable to the outside world, but in his mind it was loud. He remembered the way the light had hit the tray table on Larkspur Flight 611. He had been sitting upright, alert but calm, his infant son secured snugly against his chest. The tension in the cabin had thickened like fog after rain. Victor Halden's voice had grated at the edge of civility, just enough to feel dangerous but not enough to be dismissed outright. The discomfort of that narrow aisle, the closeness of judgmental glances, the quiet stir of a baby being used as an excuse for entitlement, all of it had unfolded like a quiet storm. Elias had not raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. What he had done, what stayed with him even now, was simple. He had waited. He had documented. He had listened. and when the world turned its eyes to him and quietly asked, "Will you move?" he had said, "No." And because of that, everything had changed. Years had passed since the investigation, since the tribunal, since the long string of statements, findings, and silent shifts behind closed conference doors. Victor's name, once sharp and commanding, had lost its weight. It faded now into a file Elias no longer opened, not out of bitterness, but because the outcome no longer needed a villain to feel complete. Still, the memory returned with a kind of gravity tonight. Milo, now nearly 6, had asked earlier during dinner, "Have I ever been in trouble on a plane?" The question had been innocent, even playful. Elias had smiled and said, "You were perfect. It was someone else who forgot how to behave." And now, standing in the doorway, Elias felt the truth of that response echo deeper. The baby, once seen as a problem, had become the reason things were now better, not just for them, but for others who would never know his name. It was not revenge. It was quiet reform. He walked to his small study, opened the drawer that held a single black folder, and pulled it out. Inside were the official findings. He flipped through them slowly, stopping at the highlighted line. The initiating passenger's complaint was determined to be rooted in personal discomfort rather than policy breach or safety concern. He had read it before. He would not need to again. What mattered more was what followed. The revisions, the training, the new phrases adopted across Larkspur Airways cabin crew manuals, thanks in part to his testimony. Clearer definiti. The new phrases adopted across Larkspur Airways cabin crew manuals, thanks in part to his testimony. Clearer definitions, firmer boundaries. Policy now tied to principle, not personal preference. And he remembered how quiet that final hearing had been. No media, no press. Just a screen, a statement, and a sleeping child in the background of his video feed. He hadn't spoken much, just a brief affirmation of the facts, and a note that no other father should have to justify their child's right to sit in peace. There had been a moment, just before disconnecting from that call, when one of the review panelists, a younger man with tired eyes, had leaned forward and said, "Your recording changed everything." Elias had nodded, but said nothing. What was there to say? That all he'd done was press a button? That all he'd done was choose not to move? Sometimes restraint was the loudest form of resistance. He closed the folder now and returned it to the drawer. In the silence he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not pride. Something steadier. He walked back down the hallway, glancing once more at Milo's door. He wouldn't tell his son the full story yet. Not until he was ready. But he would tell it one day. Not because he wanted credit, but because he wanted Milo to know that dignity didn't come from volume, and that justice, real justice, didn't always arrive with applause or headlines. It arrived in structure, in standards that stayed, in silence that held its ground. And in that final moment, as Elias turned off the last light and allowed the memory to settle back into stillness, he knew the story had ended not with retaliation, but with resolution, the kind that stays long after the noise fades. Sometimes justice moves quietly, but it still moves. By landing, the lawsuit had been filed, the man frozen in shock, and the lesson in accountability crystal clear. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision, foresight, and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores prejudice, entitlement, and the consequences of mistreating others. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on accountability, justice, and protecting the vulnerable.